Let's turn our attention to the simple argument. Rachel's gives us a version of the simple argument. Cupper refers to the simple argument as well. I'm going to give you a slightly different version, but I think it's relatively close to what Rachel says and relatively accurate to a larger context in which Singer makes these kinds of arguments. So here's my version of that simple argument. The first premise is an ethical principle. It says if we can prevent a moral harm without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, then we ought to prevent that harm. Okay? So this is a general moral principle, and it's a moral principle that you might think of as following from or being an instant of the greatest happiness principle that utilitarians rely upon to frame their theory, and Singer is, of course, a utilitarian. Second premise is an empirical claim, and that empirical claim is that we can prevent these prolonged life-threatening conditions like poverty or famine or preventable diseases and etc. by donating all or most of our expendable incomes. And by we, I mean people in relatively affluent countries. So that's just a claim about the world. That's our second premise. Our third premise says that preventing prolonged life-threatening conditions like famine and poverty has greater moral significance than sacrificing our expendable incomes. So it's a greater good to prevent these life-threatening conditions and the resulting deaths that will occur than to keep our expendable incomes and enjoy the happiness that they bring. So given those three premises, the simple argument concludes that we ought to donate all or most of our expendable discretionary incomes. So the simple argument is a simple, straightforward argument, three premises, conclusion, a deductive argument. But it's a sort of abstract theoretical argument, and its conclusion isn't one that people are sort of naturally willing or particularly strongly inclined to embrace just on its own. And so in order to bolster the simple argument, Singer adopts a second strategy. So Singer adopts the same sort of strategy that we saw him use in the racial discrimination paper. He realizes that people might not find the premises of the simple argument very intuitively or emotionally compelling, and that they might then reject the simple argument as an unsound argument. An argument that does not establish a conclusion, either because some or all of the premises are false or because it's an invalid argument. So in order to bolster the case for the conclusion and to support the premises and the simple argument, Singer then turns to looking at a couple of cases that he thinks invoke strong, relatively uniform intuitions or emotional reactions. And by analyzing these cases, he hopes to show that these cases, the intuitions, the emotional reactions that we have to the characters in them, are generated by the sorts of considerations that are the premises of the simple argument, and that they support, in fact, the conclusion that the simple argument draws from those premises as well. So by showing that the Dora and Bob cases are just instances of the premises of the simple argument, he helps to buttress the simple argument to make the premise seem more intuitively clear, as well as more likely to be accepted as correct, and also to make the conclusion seem more supported than it is just on the basis of these abstract considerations. So let's take a look at the two cases that he focuses on in the reading that we did for class. In Famine, Affluence, and Morality, he famously considers a case of a child who's drowning and someone who walks by and sees them. But in the cases he considers here, the first one is this case of Dora, who he takes from a movie. Now, Dora is a retired school teacher living, from the sounds of it, on a fixed income that allows her to survive, but doesn't seem to allow her much more than just a sustainable, continued existence without a lot of luxuries or creature comforts. Now, to supplement her income, Dora actually goes to train stations and writes letters for people who can't read or write. And in doing this, she's approached and asked to perform another task for a potential reward of $1,000, which is clearly a lot of money for her. And that task is to take a child to this address that she's given and hand him over. And she's told that the child is going to be adopted by rich people and that she's just facilitating that transfer. So she takes the child to this place. She facilitates the transfer there and then collects her $1,000. And using part of her $1,000, she buys a luxury item, a TV set. She buys something that she doesn't strictly need to maintain her existence and comfort level as it was. And then she is told by, I believe, a neighbor in the story that, oh no, this child's too old to be adopted. Clearly, you were taking this child to a ring of people who will kill that child, harvest its organs, and use them in transplant operations for people who can pay them a lot of money. So, what are the salient features of this case? Things that either Singer points to or that I point to as things that are important when we think about Dora and we think about what we judge Dora's actions to be. And Singer tells us that he thinks that most people judge Dora to have acted immorally if she didn't try to correct her error once it's pointed out to her. So, salient and important features, I think, of the Dora case here is that Dora lives in relative but sustainable scarcity. She's clearly not someone who lives in a fancy house and drives a really nice car. Right? She seems to make enough money through her pension and her supplemental income to keep her fed and clothed and sheltered, but she's not living the high life. She has a connection to the individual whose actions who is affected by her actions. So she physically sees, talks to, and otherwise interacts with this child. So she's got a direct connection. That person is, to some degree, part of her sphere of acquaintances. Her actions directly result in a harm to the child that wouldn't have befallen the child otherwise. So the child wouldn't have necessarily been taken to this house, killed, and have his or her organs harvested unless someone took her or him or her to that house. And it's Dora who does that. And so Dora directly acts in a way that results in a harm to the child that it wouldn't have probably or possibly had otherwise. So she's a player, an agent bringing about the harm in the child. However, Dora has limited insight into the consequences of her actions. It's relatively opaque to her, at least seemingly, that she's going to be taking this child to be killed and have its organs harvested. Now, we might say, well, in the back of her mind, surely she had to realize that no one is going to pay her $1,000 to walk a child to a house so that it can be adopted. Maybe, we think she probably knew it in the back of her mind, or she should have known it. She should have realized that something was wrong in the circumstances. But what is clear is that she didn't clearly and distinctly see and understand that her actions were going to directly result in the child being killed and its organs harvested. Finally, she reaps this benefit from her actions, and that benefit is sufficiently large that she's able to spend a significant portion of it on luxury, that is a TV set, on something that enriches her life, makes her happier, but is strictly speaking not important or part of one of the central human needs. She doesn't feed her, it doesn't clothe her, it doesn't give her shelter, it doesn't help her with her health. It just is something for her own enjoyment. So that's our Dora case. Next, we'll look at the Bob case.